I beg you, end it fast. And the lonely rancher did the unthinkable. Ethan Hale had lived alone for many years.
His ranch sat on the edge of a vast, empty valley, far from the nearest town. The land stretched as far as the eye could see, with rolling hills, thick forests, and a river that cut through the middle like a silver ribbon. Desk. He had inherited the property from his father, who had taught him everything about farming, raising cattle, and surviving in the quiet, sometimes harsh life of the countryside. But after his parents died, Ethan had become the only soul left on the land. There were neighbors, of course, but they lived miles away, scattered across the hills, and most of them were busy with their own lives.
The quiet around Ethan's ranch was deep, sometimes comforting, sometimes crushing.
Every morning, Ethan woke up before dawn. The rooster outside his small wooden house would crow, but he rarely waited for it.
His day started with feeding the cattle, checking the fences, and walking through the fields to make sure nothing was broken or lost. He had learned over the years to rely on his hands, his eyes, and his instincts. There was something peaceful about this routine, and yet something lonely, too. He sometimes found himself talking to the cows as he worked, not expecting them to answer, but just needing someone, or something, to hear his voice. The house he lived in was simple but sturdy. It had a small kitchen with an old stove, a living room with a fireplace, and a single bedroom with a heavy wooden bed. Everything had its place. The walls were decorated with pictures of his family from long ago, a few landscapes he had painted himself, and certificates from cattle shows he had participated in when he was younger. Desperate, it was a life built with care and patience, a life that required no one else's presence to survive. Yet, even in the comfort of his own making, Ethan felt a quiet emptiness. He would sometimes remember the days when his life had been full of people. There had been friends who visited during harvest season, neighbors who came to help repair fences, and family gatherings with laughter and the smell of freshly baked bread. But those days were long gone. Life had a way of moving on without him. People changed, moved away, or passed on, leaving him behind. The loss had not been sudden. It was slow, like a river wearing away the edges of a rock, leaving smooth surfaces but deep hollows where something had once existed. One late autumn evening after finishing the day's chores, Ethan sat on the porch, looking out at the valley. The sky was painted with shades of orange and purple, and the cold air carried the scent of wood smoke from distant chimneys. He pulled his coat tighter around him and let out a slow breath. This was his favorite time of day, when the world seemed to pause for just a moment. But even in this stillness, he felt the weight of solitude pressing down on him. It was not just the absence of people. It was the absence of connection, of understanding, of someone knowing who he truly was. That evening, as he was about to go inside for dinner, he noticed a figure moving along the edge of the property.
At first, he thought it might be one of the neighbors or perhaps a lost traveler.
But the figure was small, bent over slightly, and moved with a kind of hesitation that made Ethan pause. He had seen travelers before, hikers who had lost their way, or wanderers seeking shelter. But something about this person felt different. There was a fragility, a sense of urgency, and a quiet desperation that spoke louder than words. Ethan hesitated for only a moment before stepping down from the porch and approaching. "Hello?" he called out, his voice steady but cautious. The figure looked up, revealing tired eyes that seemed older than the face should have been. During this time, Ethan discovered small ways to help Mara manage her pain. They would sit together by the river in the mornings, listening to the flow of water and the sound of birds. They would work together in the garden, planting seeds and watching them grow as a reminder that life could still have beauty and growth. He would read to her from books, telling stories of distant lands and adventures, allowing her mind a temporary escape from her burdens. These moments did not erase the suffering. but they offered small windows of relief. Yet, Ethan could sense the limits of what he could do. Mara's pain was deep, persistent, and sometimes unrelenting. He understood that helping her would require more than physical care. It would require emotional resilience and courage. He began to learn that true support sometimes meant simply being present, holding space for someone suffering without judgment, and allowing them to feel what they felt without trying to force it away. As weeks passed, Ethan and Mara developed a quiet understanding. There was trust, fragile and tentative, but real. Mara had begun to share more of her life, her thoughts, and her fears, around in despair, of times when the world had seemed cruel and unforgiving. Ethan listened, never interrupting, never offering quick solutions. Instead, he offered stability, patience, and a reminder that someone cared. Through it all, Ethan's own perspective began to change. He realized that life was not just about survival or routine. It was about compassion, connection, and a willingness to face difficult truths. Mara's presence challenged him in ways he had never expected, forcing him to confront emotions he had long avoided. He discovered empathy, patience, and a courage that came not from strength, but from vulnerability. By the end of the second month, the bond between them had deepened. Mara was still struggling, still haunted by her past, and still occasionally speaking words of despair. But she also began to show glimpses of hope. A smile here, a laugh there, a willingness to engage in small joys. Ethan realized that healing was not linear and that moments of relief could coexist with moments of pain. Together, they learned to navigate this fragile balance, finding small ways to cope with a world that had often been unkind. Evenings on the ranch became a time of reflection. Ethan would sit by the fireplace, Mara sometimes resting her head on his shoulder, sometimes lost in thought. It did not always speak, but the quiet presence was comforting. It was in these moments that Ethan understood the profound responsibility he had accepted, not to end suffering but to share it, to witness it, and to provide a space where it could exist without judgment. In these days of shared silence and quiet care, the ranch became more than a home. It became a sanctuary, a place where two lives intersected in a world that often felt harsh and unforgiving. Ethan learned that true compassion required patience, courage, and the willingness to face suffering without trying to escape it. Mara learned that trust, even after long years of disappointment, was possible, and that connection could bring small but meaningful relief. And yet, despite all these moments of tenderness and care, Ethan knew that the shadow of Mara's plea lingered. The words, "I beg you, end it fast," had not been forgotten. They were a reminder of the fragility of life, the intensity of suffering, and the moral weight of compassion. Ethan understood that the coming days would test both of them in ways they could not yet imagine. The story of their shared life on the ranch was only beginning, and the choices ahead would challenge everything they thought they knew about pain, mercy, and the limits of human endurance. The days on the ranch grew colder as winter approached. The river had begun to freeze along its edges, and snow dusted the rolling hills and trees. Ethan Hale had grown used to the routines of the ranch, but Mara's presence made every day different. He had learned to anticipate her moods, to notice the subtle changes in her expression, and to act with patience whenever she showed signs of distress. And yet, despite all his care, the weight of her words, "I beg you, end it fast," remained a shadow over both their lives. Ethan had tried to ignore it at first, hoping that it was a moment of despair, a temporary cry for help that would pass. But over time, it became clear that Mara's suffering was constant, relentless, and deeply embedded. Her nights were often filled with tears, and her days were sometimes marked by silent despair. Even the small comforts of the ranch, the warmth of the fire, the smell of fresh bread, the quiet presence of the cattle, sometimes did little to soothe her. Ethan began to realize that no amount of food, rest, or gentle words could fully lift the weight she carried. But one afternoon, as Ethan mended a section of the fence near the edge of the property, he glanced at the house and noticed Mara standing at the window staring outside. Her posture was tense, and her hands gripped the wooden frame tightly. Ethan felt a pang of worry. He had grown accustomed to her quiet moments of reflection, but this looked different. There was a certain hopelessness in her stance, a silent plea that he could not ignore. He left his tools and walked to the house, his boots crunching on the frozen ground.
"Mara," he called softly. "Are you all right?"
She turned to him slowly, her eyes meeting his with a mixture of fatigue and fear.
"I can't do it anymore,"
she whispered, the words barely audible over the winter wind. Ethan's heart tightened. He had heard similar words before, but this time there was a difference. There was a certain finality in her tone, a sense that she had exhausted every other option. Ethan guided her inside and sat her down near the fire. "You don't have to face this alone," he said gently, placing a hand on hers. She looked at him with eyes full of pain. "You don't understand," she said, her voice trembling. "I've asked for help before, but nobody came. Nobody listened. And now..." Her words trailed off into silence. Ethan sat with her, knowing that anything he said would be inadequate. He had no magic words to fix the past, no quick solution to erase years of suffering. All he could offer was presence, patience, and care. The next few days were tense. Ethan felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him like never before. He worried constantly, checking on Mara during the night, offering warm meals and suggesting small walks to keep her mind occupied. Yet he knew that her suffering was more than physical or emotional exhaustion. It was a deep, persistent pain that had no easy remedy. And her plea for relief lingered in his mind, making him question his own limits, his own moral compass, and the very nature of compassion. Ethan found himself struggling to sleep, or staring at the ceiling, thinking about Mara, her life, and the unbearable choices that faced both of them. He asked himself again and again, how far could he go to help someone he cared for without losing himself in the process? But he knew that giving up was not an option. But he also understood that her suffering was pressing against the boundaries of what anyone could endure. One evening, as snow began to fall softly outside, Mara spoke again. "Ethan," she said quietly, "I don't want to live like this anymore." Ethan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. He knelt beside her chair, holding her hand, trying to find the right words. "You don't have to face it alone," he said softly. "We will find another way together." "I will not leave you." Mara shook her head slowly, a single tear running down her cheek. "I've lived through so much, and I can't carry it any longer. I'm tired, Ethan." Press. So tired, the gravity of her words settled heavily over Ethan. He realized that her pain was not temporary. It was deep and unrelenting. And in her honesty, she had placed a tremendous burden upon him. Ethan loved quiet and solitude, but he had never faced a moral decision of this magnitude. He had never been asked to witness suffering at this level, let alone to take action in a way that could have irreversible consequences. As days passed, Ethan began to wrestle with his thoughts more intensely. He would spend hours outside walking along the river or through the fields, thinking about what it meant to truly help someone. He reflected on his own life, his years of solitude, his losses, and the pain he had endured alone. He began to understand, painfully, that compassion sometimes demanded courage beyond what he thought possible. And that courage sometimes meant facing choices that were terrifying in their scope. One night, as the wind howled through the valley, Mara awoke in distress. Ethan sat beside her bed, holding her hand through the long hours of darkness. She trembled and whispered the words that haunted him. "I beg you, end it fast." Ethan's heart pounded. He had heard the words before, but the desperation in her voice was new, sharper and more insistent. He felt a rush of emotion, fear, sorrow, and a strange sense of helplessness. He wanted to soothe her, to tell her it would be okay, but he knew the words would not be enough. For the next few days, Ethan became restless. He walked the ranch repeatedly, feeding the cattle, mending fences, and performing every task he could think of. Yet nothing eased the weight of Mara's plea. He began to realize that he could not simply ignore it. The request had changed the dynamic between them. It was no longer about comfort or companionship. It was about confronting the very limits of morality, empathy, and human endurance. Ethan struggled with his thoughts constantly. He imagined what it would mean to refuse her plea entirely, to stand firm in the face of her suffering. He also imagined the alternative, though he knew the consequences would be profound and irreversible. Each thought tore at him, leaving him exhausted, emotionally raw, and uncertain. He had never faced a situation where the line between compassion and action blurred so completely. During this time, small moments of tenderness emerged. Mara would sometimes smile faintly when Ethan brought her tea, or when he told a story by the fireplace. She would occasionally help with small chores around the house, as if to remind herself that life could still hold purpose. These fleeting moments gave Ethan hope, yet they also made the weight of her suffering all the more profound. He realized that even brief glimpses of relief could coexist with immense pain, creating a tension that he could neither escape nor resolve easily. One morning, Ethan awoke to find Mara standing at the edge of the property, staring at the snow-covered hills. He approached quietly. "It's beautiful today," he said gently. Mara did not respond at first, her eyes fixed on the distance. Then she spoke softly. "It's so peaceful, but it doesn't change anything inside." Ethan felt the weight of her words settle into him. Breaths. She was not speaking about the land, the ranch, or the quiet beauty of nature. She was speaking about the emptiness that lingered in her heart. A void that he could not fill with any act, however kind. That afternoon, Ethan sat by the fireplace, reflecting on the past weeks. He realized that helping Mara meant more than providing food, warmth, or companionship. It meant facing her pain honestly, acknowledging the depth of her suffering, and remaining steadfast in his commitment to be there for her. But it also meant confronting his own limits, understanding that some burdens were too heavy to lift, and that sometimes the hardest act of love was to simply stand with someone, even when the path ahead was unclear. As the days grew colder and the snow thicker, Ethan found a new rhythm of care. He would rise early, feed the animals, check the fences, and then spend hours simply being present with Mara. They would sit by the river, walk through the fields, or read together in the warmth of the fire. Silence became as meaningful as conversation, and presence more important than action. Through these shared moments, Ethan discovered that compassion was not always about fixing, but about witnessing, supporting, and accepting what could not be changed. Yet, even as they built this fragile bond, Ethan knew the shadow of her plea remained. Her words had not been forgotten, nor had the intensity of her suffering diminished. They were a constant reminder that life could present choices beyond understanding, and that compassion sometimes carried a weight too heavy to bear easily. Ethan understood that the coming days would test both of them, challenging their courage, patience, and understanding in ways that neither could predict. By the end of Part 3, Ethan had arrived at a crossroads race. He had cared for Mara with patience, empathy, and steadfast presence, but her suffering had forced him to confront questions he had never faced before. How far should compassion go? What is the limit of endurance when faced with another's pain? And what does it mean to truly help someone when their request challenges the very essence of morality? The answers were not clear, but Ethan knew one thing: he could not walk away. The choices ahead would shape both their lives forever, and the path forward would require courage, heart, and an acceptance of the profound complexity of human suffering. The winter deepened, and snow blanketed the ranch in a quiet white stillness. Ethan Hale moved through his chores with the same care and precision as always, but a heavy weight pressed on his heart. Mara's suffering had not diminished, and her words, the plea that haunted him, remained ever present in his mind. "I beg you, end it fast." Those words had changed everything. They had forced him to confront a side of life he had never imagined, a responsibility he had never wanted, and a truth he could not escape. That human suffering sometimes demanded courage far beyond ordinary endurance. Ethan spent long nights sitting by the fire, thinking about what he had learned over the past months. He thought about Mara's life, her struggles, and the years of pain she had carried alone. He thought about his own life, his years of solitude, and the emptiness he had accepted as normal. And he thought about the future, uncertain, fragile, and filled with choices that could not be undone. Despite the snow and cold outside, he felt a fire of determination growing inside him. He would not abandon Mara. He would stand by her no matter what. In the quiet mornings, Ethan would prepare hot meals for Mara, making sure she ate even when she felt she could not. He would sit with her, talking softly about the land, the cattle, or stories from his past. Sometimes she would respond, offering a small smile or a quiet laugh. Other times she would remain silent, staring out the window at the snow-covered hills, lost in her own thoughts. Ethan learned to accept both, the moments of connection and the moments of despair. He understood that healing was not a straight path, and that the journey would be slow, filled with ups and downs. One day, as they walked through the fields checking the fences, Mara spoke in a quiet, almost tentative voice. "Ethan, do you ever think about what it would be like if things were different?"
Ethan stopped, looking at her carefully. "Different how?" he asked softly.
Mara paused, her eyes on the distant hills. "If life hadn't been so hard, if I hadn't felt so alone, if maybe I could have had hope before it got too heavy." Her words struck Ethan deeply. He knew there were no simple answers, only the reality that life often handed people burdens far heavier than they should carry alone. Ethan realized that his role was not to erase the past or to make all pain disappear. His role was to be there, to witness her suffering, and to show that even when life had been cruel, kindness and compassion could still exist. He understood that sometimes the greatest act of courage was simply to stay, to provide a safe place, and to offer a hand when someone was ready to take it. As the snow fell more heavily, Ethan noticed that Mara's health seemed fragile.
She moved slowly, often pausing to rest. She sometimes struggled with even simple tasks, and he could see the exhaustion in her eyes.
Despite this, she never asked him to leave, never demanded anything, and never showed bitterness toward him. Ethan admired her resilience, her courage, and the way she continued to face life even when it seemed unbearable. But the shadow of her plea remained. Ethan knew that at any moment her despair could return, stronger than before. The moral weight of her words pressed on him constantly. He realized that he had reached a point where he had to face the reality of human suffering without flinching, to understand that sometimes the choices we face are not easy, and that compassion is not always simple pain. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, Mara sat by the fire, her hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea. Ethan watched her silently, reflecting on the months they had spent together. He thought about the moments of despair, the moments of hope, and the fragile bond that had grown between them. She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and trust. She whispered, her voice trembling.
Ethan shook his head gently.
"You're not a burden. You never have been. We're in this together. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. She sighed softly, leaning back against the chair.
I know, but sometimes the pain is too much.
It doesn't go away. Ethan reached out, placing a hand over hers. I can't make it disappear, he said quietly, but I can stay with you, and we can face it together. Over the following days, Ethan focused on keeping Mara safe, comfortable, and as calm as possible. He would spend hours talking to her about small things, stories from the past, memories of better days, the rhythm of the ranch, and even the beauty of the snow-covered valley. He learned that sometimes small moments of attention and care could offer relief far greater than words or advice. The presence of another person, steady and reliable, could be a lifeline when life felt overwhelming. One night, as a storm raged outside, Mara awoke in distress. She was trembling, her breathing quick, and her eyes filled with tears.
Ethan sat beside her, wrapping her in a warm blanket and holding her hand. I'm here, he whispered.
Psst. You're not alone. We'll get through this. She clung to him, shaking, her voice breaking. I'm so tired, I don't know how much longer I can keep going. Ethan's heart ached, but he remained calm. He knew that the greatest act of courage was to stay present, even when he felt powerless. The storm passed slowly, and by morning the world outside was silent and white. Mara rested, and Ethan sat nearby, reflecting on the months they had shared. He realized that he had learned more about compassion, courage, and human connection than he had ever imagined. Bust, unfair and relentless, but even in the darkest moments, empathy and care could create a small sanctuary, a place where suffering could be shared and the weight of despair could be lessened, if only slightly. Break, and the snow began to melt slowly, revealing the green shoots of spring beneath the frozen ground. Mara's health remained fragile, but she began to show small signs of improvement. Brace. She walked more steadily, helped with chores more frequently, and even laughed quietly at times. Ethan noticed the changes with cautious hope, understanding that healing was gradual and fragile, but possible. One afternoon, as they sat by the river, Mara spoke softly. I think I can keep going, she said. Ethan looked at her carefully, a mixture of relief and cautious optimism in his expression.
That's good, he said gently.
You don't have to do it alone. We'll take it one day at a time. She nodded, a small smile appearing on her face. For the first time in months, there was a sense of hope in her eyes, a recognition that life could hold moments of peace even amidst struggle. Ethan realized that the true lesson of the past months was not about fixing all pain or making life perfect. It was about presence, empathy, and resilience. It was about standing beside someone in their darkest moments, offering care and understanding without judgment, and allowing them to find their own strength at their own pace. He understood that compassion was not measured by grand gestures, but by the quiet, consistent acts of love and patience that showed someone they were not alone. The ranch itself seemed to reflect this subtle transformation. The animals moved with renewed energy. The fields began to recover from the harsh winter, and even the house felt warmer, filled with the presence of two lives that had grown intertwined. Ethan and Mara had built a fragile but real connection, one that balanced the harshness of reality with the gentleness of shared humanity. As the months passed, Mara began to regain confidence. She participated more actively in daily chores, helped Ethan care for the animals, and even began to speak more freely about her past, her struggles, and her hopes for the future. Ethan listened patiently, offering guidance, support, and encouragement whenever needed. Together they faced the challenges of life on the ranch, understanding that while the past could not be changed, the present and future could be shaped with care, courage, and compassion. In the end, Ethan understood that the true test of humanity was not in avoiding suffering, but in facing it with empathy and resilience. Mara's plea had forced him to confront moral, emotional, and spiritual challenges he had never anticipated. It had shown him that life could demand extraordinary courage, but that even the heaviest burdens could be shared and lightened with understanding and compassion. The story of Ethan Hale and Mara did not end with dramatic events or sudden revelations. It ended quietly in the rhythm of daily life on the ranch, with snow melting into spring, animals thriving in the fields, and two lives slowly finding balance and connection. It was a story of endurance, empathy, and the transformative power of human presence. The understanding that even in the darkest moments, hope could exist, and hearts could heal, if only someone was willing to stand beside you. In the soft golden light of the late afternoon, Ethan and Mara sat together on the porch, looking out over the valley. The river sparkled in the sunlight, the hills rolled peacefully into the distance, and the wind carried the promise of new beginnings. Mara leaned slightly toward Ethan, a quiet trust between them that spoke louder than words. Ethan felt a sense of peace, fragile but real, knowing that he had stayed, that he had offered care, and that in the face of suffering he had chosen compassion over despair. And in that quiet moment, the ranch, the valley, and the lives within it seemed to hold a simple truth. That even the heaviest burdens could be carried together. That human connection could be a sanctuary, and that courage was not measured by extraordinary feats, but by the quiet persistence of presence, empathy, and love in the lives of those who need it most. The person's clothes were worn and dirty, and there was a faint tremble in their hands. Ethan felt a sudden surge of concern mixed with curiosity. He had spent years alone, and yet the sight of someone in need stirred something inside him. A part of him he thought had been buried long ago. "Are you lost?" he asked gently. The visitor nodded, but did not speak at first. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the distant sound of the river and the rustling of leaves in the evening breeze. Ethan stepped closer, keeping his voice calm. "Come inside!" Breaths. "You must be cold and tired."
You can warm up by the fire.
Breaths. Reluctantly, the person followed him.
Inside the small house, the visitor's eyes took in the modest surroundings with a mix of gratitude and caution.
Ethan placed a pot of water on the stove for tea and handed them a blanket. The visitor shivered and accepted both without a word. Ethan watched quietly, sensing that words were not yet ready to come. In the silence, the weight of unspoken pain hung heavily in the room. Over the next few days, the visitor remained at the ranch. Ethan provided food, a bed, and a safe place to rest. Slowly, the person began to share pieces of their story. They had come from a life filled with struggle, illness, family conflicts, and the isolation of a world that had grown indifferent to their suffering. Ethan listened without judgment, letting the story unfold at its own pace. He did not interrupt, did not offer solutions, but simply provided a presence. It was something both of them needed, a connection, however brief, to remind them that they were not entirely alone. As the days turned into a week, Ethan noticed a change in the way he felt. This routine, once predictable and empty, now included moments of concern and care for another person.
He found himself looking forward to their conversations, small as they were, and even the quiet times when no words were spoken.
There was a subtle shift in the ranch, too. The house felt warmer, the air lighter, as if the presence of another soul had altered the very atmosphere.
Yet even as he felt the shift, Ethan knew that he could not ignore the weight behind the visitor's eyes.
There was a pain there that went beyond exhaustion or fear. It was a deep, persistent sorrow that had followed the person for years, a burden that could not be lifted easily. Breaths. Ethan tried to offer small comforts, hot meals, a clean bed, and the quiet reassurance of his presence, but he knew that some wounds ran too deep for simple remedies. One evening after dinner, the visitor finally spoke more openly. Their voice was soft, almost a whisper, but steady. "I don't know how much longer I can keep going," they said. Breath. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine, not from fear but from the gravity of the words. He had never encountered someone so utterly drained, someone whose heart seemed to carry the weight of the world on their own. He did not know what to say. He had spent his life solving practical problems, fixing fences, feeding cattle, repairing broken equipment, but this was not a problem that could be fixed with work or skill. Instead, Ethan sat in silence, letting the words settle. He realized that this moment was pivotal, not just for the visitor, but for himself. He had spent so many years alone believing that life could be measured in tasks and routines, that emotion and connection were luxuries he could not afford. But now, facing someone who needed more than food or shelter, he understood that life was more than survival. It was about presence, understanding, and sometimes bearing witness to the pain of another. The visitor's condition did not improve quickly. Some days were better, with laughter breaking through the gloom, and other days were worse, filled with quiet tears and restless nights. Back, Ethan learned to navigate this unpredictability, adjusting his own routines to meet the needs of someone who had lived a life of hardship. He discovered patience he did not know he had, empathy he had never practiced, and a courage that came from facing suffering directly rather than hiding from it. Through it all, the ranch remained their shared world. The cattle continued to roam the fields, the river flowed steadily, and the seasons changed without pause. Yet, inside the house, a fragile bond was forming. Two lives, previously separate and solitary, now intersected in ways that were both unexpected and profound. Ethan began to understand that sometimes the greatest challenge was not in surviving alone, but in opening oneself to another person, even when it brought uncertainty and risk. By the end of the first month, Ethan and the visitor had settled into a rhythm. There were no dramatic events, no sudden transformations, only the quiet, steady presence of each other. Ethan continued his work on the ranch, but now he did so with an awareness that his life was shared, even in small ways. He found satisfaction in helping someone heal, not just physically, but emotionally. And the visitor, in turn, began to trust again, learning that connection did not always lead to pain, that sometimes it brought comfort and hope. In this slow, careful way, the first part of their story ended, not with fireworks or dramatic turns, but with the simple truth that lives, no matter how lonely or isolated, could still intersect. Ethan had found a purpose beyond his own survival, and the visitor had found a refuge in the most unlikely place. The ranch, once a symbol of solitude and distance, had become a place of tentative healing, a reminder that even in the quietest corners of life, people could still find connection, understanding, and perhaps a hint of peace. The days after the visitor's arrival settled into a quiet routine on the ranch. Ethan Hale had grown used to the small presence beside him in the mornings and evenings. The visitor rarely spoke much at first, but each day fragments of their life emerged like scattered pieces of a puzzle. Slowly, Ethan began to understand the depth of the struggles that had brought this person so far from home. The visitor's name was Mara, and she was young, yet there was a weariness in her eyes that seemed far beyond her years. Her voice carried traces of past hardships, illnesses that never seemed to end, family conflicts that had left her feeling abandoned, and moments of sheer loneliness that had become her companion long before she reached Ethan's ranch. She spoke hesitantly at first, testing Ethan's patience and empathy, almost as if expecting him to turn her away. But Ethan only listened. He had learned over the years that sometimes the most important thing was to simply be present, to witness someone's pain without rushing to fix it. Over the first week, Ethan noticed that Mara's steps were slow, her hands trembling slightly when she carried a cup of tea, and her face often pale as if the weight of her life were pressing down on her from within. Yet she tried every day to help in small ways, sweeping the floor, feeding the chickens, or stacking firewood. It was her way of showing gratitude and of reminding herself that she still had the strength to do something, even when her own heart felt heavy. Base. One chilly morning, as the sun rose behind the hills, Ethan found Mara sitting by the river, staring at the water as it flowed quietly over the stones. He approached slowly, not wanting to startle her. "You've been quiet this morning," he said gently. Mara didn't respond at first. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she spoke. "It never stops, you know, the pain." He had expected to hear about hardships, but not such raw honesty so soon. He sat beside her on the riverbank, letting the cold morning air surround them. "I can see that," he said softly. "But you're here now, and that counts for something." Mara shook her head slightly, a small, sad smile crossing her lips. "I wish it counted more," she said. "I wish it could erase the things that came before." Ethan had spent his life solving problems, repairing fences, managing cattle, ensuring the ranch thrived. But this was a type of suffering he could not fix with skill or strength. He realized that he could offer comfort, companionship, and a safe space, but he could not erase her past. The past was a shadow that clung tightly, and Mara carried it with her wherever she went. Breaths. As days turned into weeks, Ethan began to notice more signs of Mara's struggle. She would sometimes wake in the middle of the night, sitting on the edge of her bed, staring into the darkness with a vacant expression. Her appetite was inconsistent, and she would sometimes avoid meals, claiming she wasn't hungry. Ethan tried to approach her gently, offering food and warmth, but she often declined, retreating further into herself. It was a type of pain he had never encountered directly, and he felt both helpless and responsible. One afternoon, while repairing a section of the fence that had been damaged by the wind, Ethan overheard Mara talking quietly to herself in the living room, but she was muttering words that made his heart tighten. I can't do this anymore." The voice was trembling, filled with exhaustion and fear. Ethan set down his tools and entered the room. Mara turned, her eyes wide with shame and vulnerability. She tried to hide the tears, but they had already started falling. I don't want to be like this anymore," she said, her voice breaking.
Ethan knelt beside her, careful not to overwhelm her with questions. "I know it's hard," he said.
"But you're not alone here. You're safe. We can face this together." Mara shook her head slowly, a mix of frustration and hopelessness crossing her face. "You don't understand." "It's not just hard. It's unbearable. I've tried to live with it for so long, and I can't keep going like this." The words struck Ethan deeply. He had seen loneliness, sadness, and grief before, but never so intense. So absolute. The weight of it pressed down on him as if he could feel her pain physically. Ray. He realized that helping her would require more than shelter, food, and conversation. It would require patience, understanding, and a willingness to sit with discomfort even when it felt overwhelming. Over the next few days, Ethan did everything he could to provide Mara with comfort. He would sit quietly with her during meals, encourage her to rest, and accompany her on short walks around the property. He even tried to bring some small joys into her life: warm blankets, hot chocolate on cold nights, and the occasional storytelling by the fireplace. But Mara's pain was persistent, like a shadow that could not be shaken. But she appreciated the gestures, yet there were moments when she would retreat into herself, leaving Ethan to watch helplessly from a distance. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills and the sky turned shades of pink and gold, Mara spoke words that would haunt Ethan for the rest of his life. She looked at him with tear-filled eyes and whispered, "I beg you, end it fast." The words were shocking, impossible to ignore. He had never imagined that someone would place such a request in his hands. His mind raced, torn between horror, compassion, and disbelief. He wanted to comfort her, to convince her that life could still hold meaning. But the depth of her suffering made him realize that simple words might not be enough. "I can't," he said finally, his voice trembling.
I could never do that. You're not alone, Mara.
"You're safe here. We'll find another way, Brace." She shook her head, her expression filled with sorrow and exhaustion. "You don't understand," she said quietly. "It's not about being safe. It's about breath. The pain. It never stops. Duration. Every day is unbearable." Ethan didn't know what to say. He had faced challenges and hardships in his own life, but nothing like this. He realized that her request was not meant to punish him, nor was it a casual statement. It was the honest expression of someone at the very edge of their endurance.
He felt a mixture of fear, sadness, and responsibility.
He knew he had to stay calm, but the weight of the situation pressed down on him like a heavy stone. The nights became the hardest. Bassidy's crying quietly or sitting in silence, staring at nothing. Ethan would sit beside her, holding her hand, or simply keeping her company, knowing that his presence alone could provide some comfort. They did not always speak, but there was a fragile understanding between them. She trusted him enough to let him be there, even if she could not yet trust herself. Ethan also began to reflect on his own life. He had spent so many years in isolation, thinking that survival and routine were enough. Now he understood that life was more than work and self-sufficiency. It was about connection, about witnessing the pain of another person, and about choosing to stand with them even when the path was difficult. He realized that he could not solve all of Mara's problems, but he could offer compassion, patience, and the knowledge that she was not entirely alone.